What is up, everyone? So I'd like to start off this video by asking you one simple non-rhetorical question. Do you guys like Spider-Man? Well, too bad, I'm going to talk about him anyway. Spider-Man. What can you say about him? He's not only my favourite superhero, but one of my favourite fictional characters in general. Which is why, despite the fact that his movies are quite various in quality, there isn't a single one that I don't to some extent enjoy watching. To the point where I own every single live-action Spider-Man movie that's in the main series in some physical form. I have the entire Sam Raimi trilogy with Tobey Maguire. I have both of the Mark Webb movies with Andrew Garfield. I have the two MCU Spider-Man solo movies directed by John Watts and starring Tom Holland. And I own the entire spectacular animated series on DVD because this show is amazing and in my opinion by far the best interpretation of the character. I could go on for ages on why I love this show so much, but that would require its own dedicated video, so the spectacular Spider-Man is a topic for another time. So excluding Into the Spider-Verse and Venom, these are the 7 movies I'm going to be talking about today. Because I am sure that we can all acknowledge that some of these movies are a lot better than others. So let's rank them! Number 7. The Amazing Spider-Man. Yeah, kinda making the bold choices right from the start, aren't I? The biggest thing The Amazing Spider-Man has going against it is just how bland it is. This whole movie just feels like a dull, bleak, uninspired, and lackluster, and almost an unoriginal, exact retelling of the original Spider-Man directed by Sam Raimi from 2002. With a serious cookie-cutter plot that is full of major plot conveniences. Not to mention the numerous occasions when this movie introduces new story arcs, and then completely abandons them halfway through the movie and are never mentioned again. It's like the movie got a case of amnesia and completely forgot about these plot points. The movie ironically advertises itself as the untold story and establishes a compelling mystery about Peter's missing parents, but that story is completely dropped halfway through the movie and is never mentioned again until the sequel. Watching The Amazing Spider-Man feels like reading a novel, getting halfway through the novel, and then you proceed to drop the book onto the floor, and then you walk away and never touch it again. The movie does have a few saving graces though. Andrew Garfield is sensational as Spider-Man. I like Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy, it has a compelling villain, I really like the score, and the action, while not the best, is still quite entertaining. I like the scene on the bridge, and I especially love the fight in the high school. Also, this bit makes me laugh.
I'm gonna throw you out the window now.
And I think that's it. Number 6. The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Yeah, as much as I tried to defend this movie a few years ago, because I was naive, I do have to acknowledge that The Amazing Spider-Man 2, to put this lightly, is not very good. My biggest issue with the movie is that the plot is extremely messy, mostly coming from the fact it's trying to tell 50 stories all at the same time, all within the span of 2 hours. Also, I think it's kind of hilarious that the full title of the movie is not The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but in fact, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 Rise of Electro, a title that is so generic that literally nobody uses it. And by having so many subplots, the movie really suffers underneath its own weight. I would have sympathised with Electro if it wasn't for the fact that I can't relate to him, simply because the beginning of the movie paints Max Dillon as nothing more than a creepy stalker. And when he becomes Electro, he's not nearly as intimidating as he could have been. Especially considering in Spider-Man the new animated series from 2003, Electro is shot like a horror movie. Add that on top of the fact that in the movie he's played by Jamie frickin' Foxx, an actor who can be absolutely terrifying as a villain. And this is coming from somebody who almost had anxiety watching him in Baby Driver. Harry Osborn started as compelling, being thrown into a desperate sympathetic situation to the point where I was practically rooting for him to team up with Electro so he could get the cure for his disease. Unfortunately, the moment he becomes the Green Goblin, all likability and relatability is completely thrown out the window. However, there is a reason I defended this movie as much as I did. It's really not that bad. Andrew Garfield is phenomenal, the cinematography is gorgeous, the web swinging is shot in a way that it feels like you're up in the air swinging with him, and the action is an absolute blast. I mean, look at this! How is this not entertaining? The movie is seriously flawed. But to an extent, I still like it. But it stays at number 6 because the story's still abysmal, and Peter still lets innocent people die. Hey, Mr. Criminal, I know I should be stopping you right now, but I'm really hungry, so I'm gonna go get Subway. Bye! Spider-Man! With great power comes great irresponsibility. Number 5. Spider-Man 3. Spider-Man 3 suffers from a very similar problem to The Amazing Spider-Man 2. It just suffers underneath its own weight. Specifically this time, it's because the movie has 3 villains. And Sam Raimi's response of trying to balance all 3 of these villains is by constantly pushing them out of the way to focus on other ones. They introduced a symbiote with little to no explanation, and by the time Peter gets the black suit, he locks it up in a briefcase until it's nearly time to get rid of it. And when he does, Venom only gets about 6 minutes of screen time. Sandman is great for spectacle, but the character himself is about as interesting as a baked potato. Riveting! Also, I for the life of me cannot stand the retcon of Flint Marko being Uncle Ben's true accidental killer. And poor Harry, who should have been the villain of the movie, gets amnesia 20 minutes in, and he doesn't get his memory back until towards the end of the movie. I'm not a huge fan of Topher Grace as Eddie Brock. Gwen Stacy is a completely useless character, and the relationship between Peter and MJ is so toxic and lacking in communication that I barely understand what they see in each other. Also, emo Peter is terrible and needs to burn in a fire. Spider-Man 3 is monumentally flawed, and yet miraculously, it's still a really entertaining movie. It's got some great action, some genuinely hilarious moments, and I love the cast, for the most part. I love Tobey Maguire as Peter Parker, I love Rosemary Harris as Aunt May, Kirsten Dunst is great as MJ, I love James Franco as Harry Osborn. This is a great cast. Despite how shallow the subplots are, a lot of them are still quite compelling. I love the score, and it has great pacing. Honestly, there's a really good movie in here. Had Sandman been removed or at least tweaked, Peter and MJ been given a much healthier relationship, Harry been made as the villain of the series, and then turned the Venom arc into a 2-movie story arc like they did with Avengers Infinity War and Endgame, I think this movie could have rivaled against the first 2 movies in the Sam Raimi trilogy. Spider-Man 3 could have been a lot worse. But it also could have been a lot better. Number 4. Spider-Man Homecoming. While I initially loved Spider-Man Homecoming, it is a movie I liked a little bit less upon subsequent viewings. When it comes to Homecoming's shortcomings, honestly, for me, a lot of it has to do with the movie's contribution to the MCU. Despite the fact that Tony Stark is only physically in the movie for about 10 minutes, it still feels like he completely overshadows the movie, because everything about Tony Stark drives Peter forward, and therefore it drives the story forward. Peter's whole motivation is about going on their next Avengers mission and trying to live up to Tony's expectations. Also, I just don't really get where Tony's coming from in this movie. He punishes Peter for trying to prove himself and face the Vulture, only for him to reward Peter for trying to prove himself and face the Vulture. What? Additionally, the movie feels like it's trying so hard to conform to the MCU that it feels like it lacks an identity. Exacerbated by the fact that I find the story and the action to be quite generic and underwhelming. The best way I can describe it is that other movies like Spider-Man 2 feels like a creation, a passion project created by an artist. It feels personal, it feels wholesome, and it feels like it was made with tender love and care. Spider-Man Homecoming feels like a product that was manufactured in a factory, giving it a much more artificial feel. That product may be high quality, but it lacks that personal touch. The movie is still entertaining. Tom Holland absolutely nails both roles as Peter Parker and Spider-Man. Ned is absolutely lovable and hilarious. I love Ned. And the action, though underwhelming, is still quite entertaining, and the movie has an excellent villain. In a nutshell, Spider-Man Homecoming is entertaining, but a little bit generic. Number 3. Spider-Man. This movie is a classic. I do have some nitpicks with it, like the age of the high school students who look older than I do, despite the fact that I'm 20 years old. And at times it's really, really cheesy and a bit hard to take seriously. Also, I don't like how this is a cinematic superhero movie that doesn't use a 2:35 aspect ratio. That just drives me nuts. But really, in terms of faults, that's about it. The origin story is very well told and beautifully paced, and William Dafoe as the Green Goblin is immensely entertaining. And I'm gonna make a bold statement, I kind of like the Green Goblin's design. I mean, I get it, he kind of looks like a Power Rangers villain, but honestly, I don't care. I still think he looks badass. Though that doesn't really negate the fact that the Green Goblin's kind of stupid at one point.
Jameson, you slime! Who's the photographer who takes the pictures of Spider-Man?
Let's see. I have no idea. Tobey Maguire is great. In my opinion, Tobey Maguire is the definitive live-action Spider-Man. The action, if a bit stiff at times, is still incredibly entertaining. I love the fight at the festival, I love the fight in the burning building, I love the climax. The movie has a great cast, and I absolutely love the design of the suit. It's so iconic that whenever I just hear the name Spider-Man with no context, generally the Raimi suit is the very first thing that pops in my head. There really isn't much else to say. It's a great introduction for those who are unfamiliar with the character, and it's still a lot of fun to this day. I still love this movie. Number 2. Spider-Man Far From Home. Oh my god, this is such a good movie. Granted, to some extent, Far From Home does kind of have some of the same issues I mentioned about Homecoming. However, unlike Homecoming, Far From Home more than makes up with it with far more engaging characters and storytelling. Tom Holland gives an even better performance here than he did in Homecoming. Ned is still amazing, and the action set pieces are absolutely spectacular. It's pretty clear to me that the visual effects team had a blast putting this movie together. And it makes sense that they would, considering at their disposal they had the creativity behind Mysterio. And speaking of Mysterio, Mysterio alone is one of the reasons why this movie is so high on the list. Some people have tried to criticize this movie by saying that the twist was too predictable, and my response to that is, Mysterio is an iconic comic book villain. Of course we know he's going to be the bad guy. And the way they executed it was kind of brilliant. First off, I see it as dramatic irony, which is a storytelling technique where we as an audience know something that the characters don't, which can add a lot more tension if you do it correctly. And throughout the first act of the movie, I was constantly asking myself questions. Questions such as, okay, are they genuinely going to make him a good guy here and they're just going to have a bit of a fallout? Or is this going to be a syndrome-like situation where he's just pretending the whole time? And I'm going to sound kind of nuts for saying this, but as the movie progressed, he started to earn my trust. Considering he's played brilliantly by Jake Gyllenhaal, he's so likable and charming and relatable and charismatic that I started to care about this character to the point where I fell for his lies with Peter Parker. So even though I kind of saw the twist coming, I still felt that betrayal. And then there's MJ, who is my favourite love interest in any superhero movie ever. Their relationship is healthy, it's full of communication, she's charming, she's lovable, she's adorable, she's funny, she's hilarious, and she is so damn smart. Even as a kid, there were a bunch of dots that I thought were incredibly obvious, and the fact that nobody in superhero movie history seems to connect these dots is something that drove me nuts. And to this day, I only know 2 characters who were smart enough to figure out this character was a superhero by asking one simple question. Why is it that Peter Parker and Spider-Man are never seen together at the same time? And even as a kid, it drove me nuts that no one else seemed to see this, except for Lois Lane from Superman 2 and MJ from Spider-Man Far From Home. I love the love interest, I love the villain, I love the action, I love Tom Holland, I just love this movie! Combine all this and you have one of my favourite Spider-Man movies to date. Except for number 1. Because at number 1, we have The Spectacular Spider-Man. Seriously, I'm not joking. Go watch this show. It's amazing. Number 1. Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man 2 is one of my favourite movies of all time. I love this movie. Tobey Maguire absolutely knocks it out of the park. Doc Ock is a badass villain with an incredibly identifiable motivation. And this movie has some of the best action sequences in the series. The one thing I love about the action in this movie is how it takes full advantage of Spider-Man's powers, which allows for a fight sequence that takes place entirely on the wall of a skyscraper, or how during the train fight he uses his webbing abilities to stay on the train. But the movie at its core tells a really wholesome story about the importance of redemption and self-sacrifice. Illustrated in ways outside of Peter almost sacrificing his life to save everyone on the train, and Doc Ock legitimately sacrificing himself to save New York. It's a story about an everyday man struggling to maintain balance between having a healthy everyday life and his responsibilities of being Spider-Man. Spider-Man saves a lot of lives, but it comes at a cost, and that cost being Peter neglecting those he cares about the most. So, he gives up, and when he does, Aunt May, beautifully played by Rosemary Harris, gives a really touching speech about the importance of self-sacrifice, about how to do the right thing. Sometimes we have to give up the very thing we love the most. I love how he adapts to this lesson, and after learning this lesson for himself, he then applies the exact same lesson to Doc Ock, and it's the only way he is able to win the fight and reason with him to save New York. Had Spider-Man not learned this lesson himself, he would not have been able to save New York. He would have failed. And that is beautiful storytelling. This whole movie is so rich with theming that I just want to study it. And aside from that, it's just a really entertaining movie. If I'm not in an analytical mood, I could easily switch my brain off and have just as much fun with it. It's the best Spider-Man movie ever made, and it's one of my favourite superhero movies ever made. Spider-Man 2 is so good, it's the reason I fell in love with the character. And that is why it is my favourite Spider-Man movie to date. And that's my ranking of the Spider-Man movies, but what are yours? Let me know in the comments down below. Stay tuned till my next video, but until then... shit.